There's a moment in the Thriller music video, released in December 1983, watched by more people than any music video had ever been watched before, where Michael Jackson turns to the camera and smiles. He has just transformed into a werewolf and back again. He is surrounded by an army of dancing undead. The production is unlike anything that had ever appeared on music television. And then he turns and smiles, and in that smile there is something that no transformation sequence and no choreography can entirely explain. A quality of presence. A sense of someone who knows something that the rest of us do not, who is operating in a register slightly different from the one ordinary humans occupy, who is genuinely at home in a world that most people can only visit. That smile is still there, 40 years later, in the faces of the people who are encountering his music for the first time. The young people who found their way to Smooth Criminal and Human Nature and Don't Stop Till You Get Enough through TikTok videos and a biopic that told them he existed. They find the music and something in it reaches them immediately, across decades and across the vast change in everything that has happened in the world since it was made, and they smile that smile back at him. Tonight we are going to try to understand why. Not to explain it away, there is no explaining it away, but to understand what we are dealing with when we are dealing with Michael Jackson. Because what we are dealing with is genuinely unlike anything else. Get comfortable. Let your body settle. Let the noise of your day begin to retreat. Not gone, just further away, like music playing in another room. Tonight we are going somewhere that is strange and sad and extraordinary. We are going to follow a boy from a small city in Indiana who became the most famous person in the world, who achieved things that no one before him had achieved, and who was also, behind all of it, through all of it, in ways that the fame both produced and obscured, profoundly and completely alone. If this kind of storytelling is what you come here for, a like or a subscription means more than you might think to a small channel like this one. It is how these stories find the people who need them. Now let everything else go. We are starting in Gary, Indiana, in 1958, in a house where a father named Joe Jackson was already planning something. Gary, Indiana is a city on the southern shore of Lake Michigan, about 30 miles from Chicago. In 1958, it was a city built around steel, the mills that employed thousands of men in work that was hard and loud and dangerous, and that defined the economic and social texture of everything around them. Joe Jackson worked in the mills. He also played guitar in a rhythm and blues band called the Falcons, which did not make money but which occupied something in him that the mills could not. He had married Catherine Screws in 1949, and they had 10 children, and in the children he saw something that the mills had not given him, and that the Falcons had not quite managed to deliver: a path out. Not his path, their path, which he intended to direct. The Jackson family home on Jackson Street, the address is not a coincidence, but also not the point, was small and crowded and organized around the father's ambitions for his children's talent in ways that were, by the accounts of the children themselves, both intensely productive and genuinely damaging. Joe Jackson has been described in various ways over the years, as a taskmaster, as a disciplinarian, as a man who recognized extraordinary ability in his children and pushed it with a relentlessness that produced extraordinary results at costs that his children were still paying decades later. Michael, who was the youngest of the performing brothers, and who showed from the beginning a quality that even his siblings recognized as different in kind, rather than just degree, bore the most particular version of these costs. The Jackson Five, Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, Marlon, and Michael, began performing together in 1964, when Michael was 6 years old. They performed at local talent shows and clubs, building a reputation in the Gary area before being brought to the attention of Motown Records in 1969. The audition and signing were the beginning of something that none of them could have fully understood at the time. Michael was 11 years old when the Jackson Five had their first #1 single. By the time he was 13, he had had 4 consecutive #1 singles, had appeared on national television multiple times, and was recognizable to millions of Americans who had never heard of Gary, Indiana. The childhood that Michael Jackson did not have, the ordinary, unobserved, self-directed experience of growing up that most people take for granted, is one of the organizing facts of his life and one of the keys to understanding the person he became. He was never a child in the way that children are children. He was always also a performer, always also an earner, always also the object of scrutiny and direction and the expectations of others. The time that ordinary children spend figuring out who they are, what they like, what the world feels like from inside their own particular skin, this time was not available to him. He spent it rehearsing, performing, traveling, being managed and directed and shaped by forces that had their own interests in what he became. He spoke about this in interviews throughout his adult life, about missing his childhood, about not knowing how to be a child, about feeling that he had been denied something fundamental that he could not recover but could not stop trying to find. These statements were sometimes received with skepticism, as a rich and famous person performing relatability, as a calculated appeal to sympathy, but the accounts of the people who knew him and the evidence of how he lived his adult life suggest that the loss was real and that it organized him in ways he could not fully escape. The music that Michael Jackson made in his adult life is inseparable from this history, because the music was always also a kind of recovery project, an attempt to create in sound what had not been available in life. The songs about childhood, about innocence, about wonder and magic, and the refusal to accept that the world of adults was the only world available, these were not calculated moves by a marketing department. They were expressions of a genuine orientation toward experience that had its roots in specific losses and specific longings that the songs were trying, in the way that music tries things, to address. Off the Wall, released in 1979, was the first fully realized statement of what Michael Jackson could do when given the resources and the collaborators that matched his ambition. Produced by Quincy Jones, who would become the most important creative partner of Michael's adult career, the album was a revelation. Not just because the songs were extraordinary, though they were, but because the production was itself a statement about what pop music was capable of. The integration of disco and funk and soul and rhythm and blues, the sophistication of the arrangements, the effortlessness of Michael's vocal performance across registers and tempos and emotional registers, all of this was new. Not new in the sense of never having existed, but new in the sense of having been assembled in this particular combination, at this particular level of achievement, by this particular person. Thriller followed in 1982 and is still the best-selling album in history. The numbers are almost impossible to process. Over 70 million copies sold worldwide, 14 singles released over the course of its chart run, 7 of those singles reaching the top 10. The album did not just sell well. It changed what the music industry understood to be possible. It changed what music videos were understood to be. The Thriller video, the Beat It video, the Billie Jean video were not promotional material for the album. They were works in their own right, with their own visual logic and their own claims on the attention. They made MTV what MTV became. They established that the visual dimension of popular music was as important as the sonic one, a principle that has organized the industry ever since. But the numbers and the cultural impact, as significant as they are still not quite the point. The point is what you experience when you listen to the music, and specifically what you experience in Michael Jackson's voice. It is a voice that does something rare. It communicates joy and sorrow simultaneously. It moves between vulnerability and power with an ease that most singers cannot manage in either direction alone. It produces in the listener a physical response that is not entirely explicable by the notes being sung. People who hear Beat It for the first time describe feeling something before they understand what they are feeling. People who hear the passage in Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, where the voices layer over each other, describe it as something close to euphoria. This is not musicology. This is the encounter with a voice that was operating at a level that is genuinely difficult to account for. The transformation of Michael Jackson's physical appearance is the aspect of his life that generated the most sustained public commentary during his lifetime, and it remains one of the more genuinely complex elements of his story. He underwent significant cosmetic surgery, beginning in the early 1980s and continuing over many years. His nose changed dramatically. His skin lightened substantially, which he attributed to a condition called vitiligo that causes the depigmentation of patches of skin, a condition that his dermatologist confirmed and that medical examination of his body after his death supported. He wore makeup. He lived in ways that made his face, by the later years of his life, look very different from the face of the child who had appeared on Ed Sullivan. The public response to this transformation was often cruel, and the cruelty said something about the culture more than it said about him. The mockery of his appearance, the reduction of a man of extraordinary talent and complexity to a series of jokes about plastic surgery, was one of the ways that the culture managed its discomfort with someone who did not fit neatly into any available category. He was black, but his skin was lightening. He was male, but his aesthetic was androgynous. He was an adult, but his interests were those of a child. He was the most famous person in the world, but he was also apparently lonely and frightened, and looking for something that his fame could not provide. None of these contradictions resolved neatly. and the mocking of his appearance was partly an attempt to resolve them by reducing him to something manageable and dismissible. The vitiligo is worth dwelling on because of what it meant to him. He spoke about it in interviews with an anguish that was unmistakable, about what it felt like to lose the uniformity of his skin, to see his body change in ways he had not chosen, to have something happen to his appearance that was both visible and misunderstood. The decision to address the condition through the lightening of the remaining darker patches was not vanity in any ordinary sense. It was a response to a medical reality, made by a person who was already subject to extraordinary public scrutiny of his appearance, who had already experienced the specific cruelty of the culture's treatment of black male bodies, and who was trying to manage an impossible situation in the only ways available to him. Neverland Ranch, which Michael purchased in 1987, is one of the more remarkable and more revealing facts of his life. He bought a 2,700-acre property in the Santa Ynez Valley north of Los Angeles and turned it into something between an amusement park and a private world, with a zoo, carnival rides, a movie theater, a train station, flower-covered paths, and a permanent invitation to children to visit and play. He called it Neverland, after the island in J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, where children never grow up, where the lost boys live outside the structures of adult life, where play and adventure and the refusal of ordinary time are the organizing principles of existence. The choice of name was not incidental. Michael identified deeply with Peter Pan, with the figure of the child who refused adulthood, who had found a way to remain in a state of permanent play and wonder, who gathered lost and lonely children around him. He saw himself in this figure, and the identification was genuine in ways that went beyond affectation. He was someone who had been denied a childhood, who was looking for it everywhere, who had the resources to construct a physical environment that represented what he was looking for. Neverland was not a strange indulgence. In a very expensive, very public, very vulnerable confession about what he had lost and what he was still trying to find. The first set of allegations against Michael Jackson emerged in 1993, when a 13-year-old boy named Jordan Chandler, who had spent significant time at Neverland and had become close to Michael, made accusations of sexual abuse. The criminal investigation that followed did not result in charges being filed. A civil case was settled out of court for a reported figure of around $23 million, with no admission of wrongdoing. The settlement was subsequently used by those who believed the allegations as evidence of guilt, and by those who did not, as evidence that the family was seeking money rather than justice. A second set of allegations emerged in 2003, when a documentary by journalist Martin Bashir showed footage of Michael holding hands with another boy, Gavin Arvizo, and describing his practice of sharing his bedroom with children as an expression of love. A criminal trial followed in 2005. Michael was acquitted on all 14 counts. The jury's verdict was clear and was based on specific problems with the prosecution's case and specific problems with the credibility of the accusers. But the acquittal did not end the conversation, because the conversation was not really about the legal standard of reasonable doubt. It was about the more difficult question of what we believe about someone when the evidence is contested and the person at the center of the question is dead. The 2019 documentary Leaving Neverland, directed by Dan Reed, presented the accounts of two men, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, who alleged that Michael had abused them as children. The documentary was powerful and distressing, and the accounts given by Robson and Safechuck were detailed and emotionally convincing. It also presented serious difficulties for those who took it as definitive. Both men had previously testified under oath that Michael had not abused them. Robson had done so as recently as 2016, and the documentary did not engage seriously with the extensive evidence presented at the 2005 trial, or with the specific reasons why the jury reached its verdict. The estate of Michael Jackson disputed the documentary's claims extensively, and specifically. The questions raised by Leaving Neverland have not been answered, and the questions raised by the evidence from the trial have not been answered either. This is the honest position. We do not know. The allegations are serious. The denials are serious. The evidence is contested, and the person at the center of the question died in 2009 and cannot speak for himself. Anyone who tells you they know the answer with certainty is claiming a confidence that the available evidence does not support. This is uncomfortable. It is supposed to be uncomfortable. The comfort of a definitive answer is not available here, and the discomfort of holding uncertainty is the only honest position. What is not in dispute is the loneliness. The accounts of everyone who knew him in the last decades of his life describe a person who was profoundly isolated. Not by choice in any simple sense, but by the combination of his own psychology and the structures of the fame that surrounded him. He was surrounded by people whose relationship to him was mediated by his money or his talent or their own ambitions, and he knew this. He was the most recognized person in the world and could not walk down a street without being mobbed. He moved between houses and hotel rooms and Neverland in ways that were not quite the movements of a person who has a home. The people who should have been his peers, the other artists of his generation, the people who might have understood what it was like to be him, were often people he did not fully trust, for reasons that were sometimes paranoid and sometimes well-founded. The relationships that seemed to sustain him most genuinely were often with people who could not see him as he was publicly seen, with children who responded to the playful and generous person he was in those contexts without the weight of the public image, with Elizabeth Taylor, who was one of the few people alive who understood from the inside what it meant to have been famous since childhood, to have grown up inside the machine of celebrity, to have never known a version of yourself that was not also a public property. Their friendship was not the eccentric spectacle it was often portrayed as. It was a relationship between two people who had access, in each other, to something they could not find elsewhere. Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009, at the age of 50. He died of acute propofol intoxication. The anesthetic had been administered by his personal physician, Conrad Murray, who was subsequently convicted of involuntary manslaughter. He was in the middle of rehearsals for a comeback tour called This Is It, which was to have been 50 dates at the O2 Arena in London. The rehearsal footage that was released after his death showed a man who was still in his early 50s, capable of doing things that dancers a generation younger could not match. The voice was there. The movement was there. Whatever had happened to him in the years between Thriller and the end of his life, the essential gift had not diminished. The grief that followed his death was global and immediate, in ways that surprised even people who understood how famous he was. The phenomenon was similar in some respects to the grief that had followed Diana's death 12 years earlier, a collective outpouring that exceeded what the usual frameworks for celebrity death could contain, that felt to the people experiencing it like something more personal and more significant than mourning a public figure. People who had not thought about Michael Jackson in years found themselves crying. People who had been his harshest critics found themselves revisiting the music and the performances with a kind of delayed recognition of what had been there all along. A generation that was not alive for Thriller, or was too young to remember it, encountered his music in the years after his death and found it doing the same thing to them that it had done to the people who heard it in real time. This is the fact about Michael Jackson's music that is most resistant to explanation. It continues to work, not in the sense of being nostalgically pleasurable, though it is that, but in the deeper sense of producing in listeners a physical and emotional response that is immediate and involuntary and not fully explicable by knowledge of who made it or when or under what circumstances. The music exceeds its context. It escapes the biography, the controversy, the decades that have passed, the changed world it now inhabits. It reaches people who know nothing about Gary, Indiana, or Neverland, or the trials, or the transformation, and it does something to them before they have had time to know anything about any of it. This is what a genius is in the most precise sense of the word. Not someone who is very talented, though the very talented people surround us everywhere, but someone whose gift operates at a level that changes the terms of what is possible, that makes available to human beings an experience that was not available before they arrived, that expands in some specific and irreversible way what music can do, or what performance can do, or what the combination of a voice and a rhythm and a set of movements can produce in the body of another person. They are also, almost without exception, difficult to be, difficult in ways that the people around them and the cultures that receive them have not always known how to manage or to protect. Michael Jackson was the most famous person in the world, and he was also, in ways that the fame both produced and concealed, one of the loneliest. He was a genius who was also a mystery to his contemporaries, a mystery to the investigators and the journalists and the biographers who have tried to understand him, a mystery to himself in ways that his interviews and his songs suggest he was aware of. The 2026 biopic that brought a new generation to his music did not solve the mystery, because the mystery is not solvable. It told a version of the story, as all biopics tell a version, and the version it told was entertaining, as his story could not help being, and partial, as all versions of his story are. The full story is larger than any container that has been found for it. What we can say with confidence is that the music remains. The performances remain, On film, in the memories of the people who saw them, in the movements of the dancers who have learned from them, in the specific way that a certain combination of notes and rhythm still produces a specific involuntary response in the bodies of people who encounter it for the first time. The enigma remains.
The questions remain.
And the boy from Gary, Indiana, who became the most extraordinary performer of the 20th century, and who paid for it in ways that no human being should have to pay. He remains, too, in the music, in the smile in the Thriller video, in whatever it is that reaches across the decades and finds the young person on TikTok who has never heard of the Jackson 5 and makes them feel something they cannot quite name but immediately recognize. That is all for tonight. I hope this gave you something to hold on to. Not answers, because there are not answers, but the company of a mystery that has been with us for decades and that will continue to be with us long after the biopics and the documentaries and the lawsuits and the albums have all had their say. Michael Jackson was the most extraordinary thing pop culture has produced. He was also a person. Both of those things are true, and neither of them cancels the other out. If you made it this far, thank you. A like, a comment, a subscription. It all means more than you might think for a small channel like this one. It is how these stories find the people who need them. Sleep well. The music is still there. I will see you in the next one. The Jackson family in the 1960s and early 1970s occupied a specific position in American black life that is worth understanding as context for what Michael became and what it cost him. The Jacksons were part of the Great Migration, the movement of black Americans from the South to the industrial cities of the North and Midwest that had been underway since the early 20th century and that had transformed both the demographic landscape of American cities and the cultural landscape of American music. Gary was one of the destinations of this migration, and the steel mills that defined its economy were one of the primary employers of the black men who came there, looking for the industrial wages that the South had not offered. The rhythm and blues and gospel and soul music that Joe Jackson played with the Falcons and that he brought into his household was the music of this migration. Music that carried the specific emotional history of the people who had made it, music that was both a record of suffering and a form of resistance to it. Michael absorbed all of this before he had the words for it. He absorbed the music that filled the house and the church. Katherine Jackson was a Jehovah's Witness, and the relationship between religious music and the secular music his father played is part of the texture of everything Michael would eventually make. He absorbed the specific quality of black performance that he encountered in the people his father admired and brought into his children's education. James Brown, Jackie Wilson, The Temptations, Marvin Gaye, people who were doing something with their bodies and their voices that exceeded what the usual categories of entertainment contained. He was watching and absorbing and learning all of this, while also, simultaneously, being formed by the machinery of the family business that his father was building. The audition for Motown is part of the mythology of his life, and like most mythology, it contains both real information and significant simplification. Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown, did sign the Jackson 5 in 1969, and the label did provide the production infrastructure and the promotion that launched the group into national prominence. What the mythology sometimes omits is how much of the work was already done, how polished and how professional the group was by the time they arrived at Motown, how thoroughly Joe Jackson had already shaped them into a performing unit of real skill. Gordy recognized something, but the something he recognized had been built over years by a father who drove his children with a relentlessness that produced results at costs that are still being reckoned with. The specific experience of being a child prodigy in the entertainment industry has been documented extensively enough that certain patterns emerge clearly. The child who performs exceptionally from a very young age develops an unusual relationship to the approval of adults, which is also the approval of audiences, a dependence on external validation that the structure of performance both creates and feeds. The child who earns money that the family depends on develops an unusual relationship to their own value, understanding themselves as valuable primarily in proportion to their productivity. The child who is managed and directed learns to understand themselves as something to be shaped by others' visions rather than as the author of their own development. Michael Jackson experienced all of these things with an intensity that exceeded most other child performers, because his talent exceeded most other child performers, and the demands placed on him scaled accordingly. The transition from child performer to adult artist is always complicated, and for members of family groups it is particularly so because the artistic identity has been built collectively, and the move toward individual expression requires both the group and the individual to change in ways that are not always welcome. Michael's solo career at Motown, which ran parallel to the Jackson 5's group output, was moderately successful but not extraordinary. The extraordinary began when he moved to Epic Records and began working with Quincy Jones, and what the move enabled was precisely the individual artistic expression that the group context had constrained. Quincy Jones is one of the most important figures in Michael's story, and one who does not always receive adequate credit in accounts focused primarily on Michael himself. Jones was a musician, arranger, composer, and producer of extraordinary range and sophistication, someone who had worked in jazz, in film scoring, in pop production, who understood what records could sound like and what performances could contain, who brought to the collaboration both technical mastery and a genuine artistic vision of his own. The partnership between Jones and Michael worked because both of them were operating at levels that required each other. Michael needed someone who could match his ambition and translate it into sound. Jones needed someone whose talent was large enough to justify the scale of production he was capable of organizing. The recording of Off the Wall and Thriller involved a level of perfectionism that the people who were present describe with a mixture of admiration and exhaustion. Michael would rehearse vocal passages until they were exactly right, not in the mechanical sense of hitting the notes correctly, but in the deeper sense of communicating the emotional content with the specificity he intended. He would do dozens of takes of a single phrase, not because the earlier takes were technically wrong, but because they were not yet exactly what he was hearing in his head. This capacity for sustained focus on the smallest details of a performance, maintained over hours and sessions and weeks, is part of what produced music that sounds the way it sounds. The effortlessness of the finished product is the product of enormous effort. The choreography that Michael developed over the same period was an equal achievement, and the two were inseparable in ways that are sometimes missed when the music and the performance are considered separately. He was studying dance continuously, the moves of James Brown and Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly, and the street dancers he encountered in Los Angeles, and synthesizing what he studied into a physical vocabulary that was entirely his own. The Moonwalk, which he debuted on the Motown 25 television special in May 1983, was not invented by Michael, but what he did with it was. He took a movement that existed in street dance and performed it at a level of precision and musicality that transformed it into something that had never quite existed before. The moment when he first slid backward across the stage while moving forward is one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of television performance. And it produced in its original audience a response, a scream of disbelief and delight, that is audible on the recording, and that communicates something true about what it felt like to witness something that the body understood before the mind had processed it. The Bad album and tour of 1987 and 1988 were the peak of Michael's commercial and critical standing before the complications of the 1990s began to accumulate. The Bad Tour, which ran for 16 months and visited 5 continents, set attendance records that stood for years and demonstrated the global scale of his following in ways that had no precedent. He was not famous in America and known internationally. He was the most famous person in every country he visited, in ways that sometimes strained the capacity of the infrastructure to manage the attention. The images of crowds outside the hotels where he was staying, the descriptions of the noise that greeted his arrivals at airports, the accounts of people sleeping outside venues for days before shows, these were not the ordinary expressions of fan enthusiasm. They were responses to something that the culture did not have an adequate category for. The Dangerous album of 1991 marked the beginning of a shift, both in the music, which moved toward harder and more urgent sounds, and in the public narrative surrounding him. The relationship with Bubbles the chimpanzee, the hyperbaric chamber, the increasingly elaborate public persona, the hypocrite mask and the surgical masks, and the various accessories of his public appearances, all of these were being assembled into a narrative about eccentricity that was both accurate and reductive, in the sense that his relationship to ordinary life was genuinely unusual. He was also doing something with his public persona that was more deliberate than the eccentricity narrative acknowledged. He was managing the distance between himself and the world in the way that someone who has been a public object since childhood learns to manage it, through the creation of layers of persona that the public can engage with while the person inside remained somewhat protected. The friendship with Elizabeth Taylor, which became publicly visible in this period, was one of the genuine relationships of his life and illuminates something important about what he needed and where he could find it. Taylor had been a child star herself, had known the specific experience of growing up in public, had navigated the studio system and the celebrity machine, and the complicated demands of being beautiful and talented and owned by an industry that had no particular interest in her well-being beyond what it could extract from her. She understood things that very few people could understand from the inside, and the friendship they developed was based on this shared understanding. When she spoke about Michael, in the years before and after his death, she spoke about him with a specificity and a warmth that came from actual knowledge of who he was, rather than from the usual combinations of admiration and projection. The years between the 1993 allegations and the 2005 acquittal were years of sustained damage to his reputation, his finances, his health, and his ability to work in the ways he had worked before. He continued to make music. High Story, the double album released in 1995, was a document of someone under siege, full of anger and pain and defiance, that was more emotionally raw than anything he had previously released publicly, and that was also, in its musical moments, genuinely extraordinary. Invincible, released in 2001, was received relatively indifferently by a public and a media establishment that had largely decided what kind of story Michael Jackson was, and that were not particularly interested in revising their verdict. The album contained some of the finest music of his career. It is still underappreciated. The This Is It rehearsals, documented in the film of the same name released after his death, show a man who had maintained something essential despite everything. The voice was there. The movement was there. The quality of attention he brought to a rehearsal, the specific way he engaged with the music and the dancers and the production, the moments of playfulness and humor and genuine warmth with the people around him, these were not the behaviors of a man who was broken, whatever else was happening in his life. They were the behaviors of an artist who was still at 50, doing the thing that was most fundamentally his, that no amount of external difficulty had managed to take from him. The new generation that discovered Michael Jackson through TikTok videos and the 2026 biopic is encountering something that their older counterparts encountered in real time, a body of work that is immediately and viscerally effective regardless of what you know or don't know about the person who made it. The moonwalk is still astonishing. Don't Stop Till You Get Enough still produces the specific sensation of being lifted slightly out of ordinary time. Billie Jean still has that bass line that sounds like it was discovered rather than composed, that sounds like something that was always waiting to exist, and he was just the one who found it. The new listeners who are finding their way to this music are not wrong to respond to it the way they respond. They are responding to something real. What they are also inheriting is the complexity, the biography that does not resolve, the questions that do not have answers, the person behind the music who was also a mystery to the people who knew him and remains a mystery to the people who are only now encountering his work. The biopic told a version of the story that was entertaining and that left some things out, as all versions leave some things out. The documentaries have told other versions. The estate has told its version. The accusers have told theirs. Michael himself told many versions across many decades of interviews, and the versions were not always consistent, which is not surprising, because people's accounts of themselves are rarely entirely consistent, and especially not when the person is also managing a public persona of extraordinary complexity at the same time. The mystery of Michael Jackson is not going to be solved. The man who could have solved it, who was the only person who could have fully explained himself, is not here. What remains is the music, and the performances, and the strange and particular life that produced them, and the questions that the life raises which the music does not quite answer, but somehow makes it easier to sit with. He was the most extraordinary thing pop culture has produced. He was also a person who suffered specific losses, and specific loneliness, and specific damage that the culture that produced and consumed, and eventually turned on him, did not adequately acknowledge or address. Both of these things are true. Both of them will still be true in 50 years. Both of them are part of what we are dealing with when we are dealing with Michael Jackson. That is what an enigma is. The specific ways in which Michael Jackson changed popular music are worth cataloging more precisely, because the general claim that he was important is less informative than a specific account of what he actually did. He changed music videos from promotional afterthoughts into artistic works in their own right, and this change was permanent. After Thriller and Beat It and Billie Jean, the music video was a different medium, with different ambitions and different possibilities than it had been before. He changed the relationship between the recorded song and the live performance, establishing that a concert could be a total spectacle, a combination of music and dance and production and theater, rather than simply a louder version of the album. He changed what the singing voice was understood to be capable of in a pop context, demonstrating that the full range of vocal possibility, the whispers, the screams, the percussive syllables, the beatboxed rhythms, the nonsense vocalizations that were also melodic statements, were available to the pop singer in ways that the conventions of the genre had not previously suggested. He also changed the economics of the music industry in ways that were not entirely beneficial. The scale of Thriller's success created expectations that the industry then applied to every major artist who followed. Expectations that albums should sell in the tens of millions, that tours should fill the largest available venues, that the commercial dimension of making music should be primary in a way that it had not always been. These expectations produced the specific pressures that define the music industry of the 1980s and 1990s, and they produced specific casualties, artists who could not sustain the scale of success that the post-Thriller industry required, who were dropped when their commercial returns declined below the threshold that Thriller had established as the standard. Michael himself was not immune to these pressures, which is part of the irony of having created them. After Thriller, every subsequent album was measured against Thriller, and every subsequent album fell short by the standards that Thriller had established because those standards were effectively impossible to meet. Bad sold 30 million copies. It was considered in the context of expectations set by Thriller a disappointment. This is the specific form of success trap that the very successful create for themselves, the achievement that becomes the standard against which all future achievement is measured, and that is so high that nothing can match it. The relationship between Michael and the press is one of the more complicated elements of his story, and it tracks the broader arc of the culture's relationship to celebrity in the 1980s and 1990s. In the early years of his solo career, the press was largely celebratory. He was the extraordinary talent who had escaped the shadow of the family group and was making something entirely his own, the Black American artist who had crossed the racial barriers of radio programming and television airplay that had prevented his predecessors from reaching the mainstream audiences their talent deserved. This celebratory period lasted through Thriller and into the mid-1980s, and during it, Michael was the subject of the kind of press attention that is the most pleasurable form. Attention that amplified his work and reflected his success back to him in ways that felt like recognition. The shift in the press coverage began gradually and then accelerated. The tabloids discovered that Michael could be made to seem strange and frightening as easily as he could be made to seem glamorous and extraordinary, that the same facts about his life that were presented as evidence of his extraordinary success and his exceptional nature could be reframed as evidence of dangerous eccentricity. The oxygen chamber, the chimpanzee, the claims about wanting to buy the bones of the elephant man, the transformation of his face, all of these things had been covered in ways that emphasized their interestingness. But they could also be covered in ways that emphasized their wrongness, their freakishness, the sense that someone who lived this way was not quite right. The transition from Wacko Jacko as a term of affection to Wacko Jacko as a term of derision happened gradually through the late 1980s, and then the 1993 allegations accelerated it dramatically. The press narrative that emerged around Michael in the 1990s was not simply the product of the allegations, which might have been addressed if they had been the only thing in play. It was the product of the allegations combining with a decade of accumulated stories about his strangeness to produce a portrait of someone who seemed, in retrospect, to have always been not quite right, who had always been hiding something, whose talent had perhaps been a cover for something that the public had been too dazzled to see clearly. This retrospective reframing of his entire history, the finding of darkness in what had previously seemed like light, is one of the more recognizable operations of tabloid coverage, and it was applied to Michael with particular force because the scale of his fame meant the scale of the potential story was enormous. What was lost in this reframing, and what the music resists, is the specificity of the person. The tabloid portrait of Michael Jackson is a portrait of a type, the fallen idol, the celebrity destroyed by his own excess, the child star who could not make the transition to adult life. It is a portrait that could apply to many people, and that does not require any knowledge of Michael Jackson specifically to construct. The music, by contrast, is entirely specific. It could only have been made by this person, with this history, with this particular combination of gifts and losses and obsessions and fears. The tabloid portrait tells you nothing about why Beat It sounds the way it sounds, or why the bridge of Thriller does what it does to the body of the listener. The music tells you something that the tabloid portrait cannot approach. The people who loved Michael Jackson, who genuinely loved him, not as a celebrity but as the specific person they knew or had encountered, describe him consistently in ways that do not match either the hagiographic version or the tabloid version. They describe someone who was funny, in a dry and specific way that surprised people who expected either the performer or the weirdo. Someone who was genuinely warm with people he trusted, physically affectionate in ways that were disarming. Someone who was curious about everything, about art, about history, about science, about people, and whose curiosity was real rather than performed. Someone who was also, simultaneously, the most guarded and defended person in almost any room he entered, who had learned over decades of being burned by trust that the circle of people who could be trusted was very small and that the cost of being wrong about someone was very high. The guards and the defendedness were not paranoia in any clinical sense. They were rational responses to a genuinely unusual situation. Being the most famous person in the world means that almost everyone who approaches you has some relationship to your fame that is prior to and more important than their relationship to you as a person. Being someone who has been burned repeatedly by betrayal, by people who sold stories, by people who used proximity to him for their own purposes, by people who were friendly until they were not, means that the calculation about who to trust has stakes that most people do not face. The isolation that resulted was real and was painful and was also, in some significant measure, the only rational response to the conditions of his life. The specific loneliness of celebrity at the scale Michael experienced, it is something that almost no one can speak to from the inside, because almost no one has experienced it. Elizabeth Taylor could, and did. A handful of other people who had been famous from childhood could offer partial understanding, but the experience of being recognized by everyone, of having your face be familiar to people you have never met in countries where you do not speak the language, of never being able to enter a public space without a protective apparatus of security and management. This experience is so far outside ordinary human experience that it creates a genuine isolation from the rest of humanity. You cannot explain it to people who have not experienced it, and the people who have experienced it are very few, and some of them have their own reasons not to discuss it honestly. The children who visited Neverland and who were given the run of the amusement park and the zoo and the movie theater represented something specific in Michael's psychology that is worth trying to understand honestly. He said, in multiple interviews, that his relationships with children were the purest relationships he had, relationships untainted by the calculations and the agendas that adult relationships with him inevitably carried. Children, he said, loved unconditionally, without reference to his fame or his money or what he could do for them. This account of what he was seeking in these relationships is credible and recognizable as human, and it also, it must be said, does not exclude the possibility that what he was seeking came into conflict with appropriate boundaries in ways that harmed the children involved. Both things can be true simultaneously. The seeking can be genuine, and the consequences can still be damaging. This is the honest complexity of what we are dealing with. The 2026 biopic's choice to focus on the music and the performances and the childhood and the creative process while handling the allegations with relative lightness was a choice that its producers and the estate were both entitled to make, and that has genuine artistic justification. There is a version of Michael Jackson's life that is worth telling that focuses on what he made rather than on what he is alleged to have done, and that version is legitimate. What it is not is complete. The complete story includes the allegations and the acquittal and the documentary and the contested evidence and the questions that remain open. The biopic told a version. Every account of him tells a version. The full story exceeds any single telling. The specific quality of Michael Jackson's voice in its prime, roughly the late 1970s through the early 1990s, is something that music writers have struggled to describe adequately, and the struggle itself is informative. The usual vocabulary of voice description, range, tone, technique, gets you some of the way there, but not all the way, because what his voice did was not primarily a matter of range or tone or technique, though all of those were extraordinary. It was a matter of expressiveness, of the capacity to communicate emotional states with a precision and an intensity that went beyond what the lyrics were saying, that added dimensions of meaning to the songs that the words alone could not have carried. When he sang the word Annie in Smooth Criminal, in that particular ascending phrase that recurs throughout the song, he communicated something about urgency and fear, and the desperate quality of an appeal that the word itself, in print, contains nothing of. The voice did this. The specific way he shaped and placed and colored that word did this, and there is no way to explain how he did it that does not eventually reduce to he could and most people cannot, and the difference is what genius means. The dancers who worked with him on the Thriller video, the Bad Tour, the This Is It rehearsals describe working with him in terms that are consistent across decades. The sense of being in the presence of someone who understood dance at a level that exceeded anything they had previously encountered, who could demonstrate a movement once and have it be immediately and recognizably correct, who could see in a dancer's performance what was missing and articulate it in terms that the dancer could use, who had a physical intelligence that was as natural and as extraordinary as his musical intelligence.
The moonwalk is the famous thing.
But the moonwalk is a single movement, and his vocabulary contained hundreds of movements, each of them precise and specific and informed by a physical awareness that his collaborators found, uniformly, remarkable. The legacy of Michael Jackson and the music that has followed him is visible everywhere in contemporary pop, and not always in ways that are acknowledged. The integration of singing and dancing as equally important components of a pop performance, the expectation that a pop star is also a physical performer, that the visual dimension of the music is not optional or supplementary. This is so thoroughly embedded in contemporary pop culture that it is easy to forget that it was not always so, and that Michael was the primary agent of its establishment. The production techniques pioneered on his records, the use of layered vocals, the integration of electronic and acoustic elements, the specific way that rhythm and melody were balanced and weighted, these are foundational elements of the sound of popular music in the decades since Thriller. The artists who have cited his influence directly include people across almost every genre and generation of post-1982 popular music. Justin Timberlake, Usher, Beyoncé, Bruno Mars, The Weeknd. The list of contemporary artists who have spoken about the specific ways in which Michael Jackson's work shaped their understanding of what was possible is very long and includes people whose work superficially sounds nothing like his. The influence is not always stylistic. It is sometimes more fundamental than that, an influence on what the ambition for a pop career looks like, on what the standard for a live performance is, on what the relationship between a recorded work and a visual presentation can be. The specific circumstances of his death, the propofol administered by the doctor who was paid to ensure he could sleep, the impossibility of the touring schedule he had agreed to, the physical condition he was in as a result of years of difficulty in treatment and the various pressures his body had been subjected to. These are not simply a medical story. They are the culmination of a life in which the demands placed on him had consistently exceeded what any human body could sustainably provide, and in which the people around him had consistently prioritized his productivity over his well-being. Conrad Murray was convicted, and the conviction was appropriate. But the system that created the conditions in which Murray's intervention was possible is larger than Murray, and involves the concert promoters and the management and the commercial infrastructure of the entertainment industry that had been extracting from Michael Jackson since he was 6 years old. The 50 years of life he was given produced a body of work that will last much longer than 50 years. This is the basic arithmetic of genius. The work outlasts the life, and the life, even a short and difficult one, generates enough material to sustain the work's significance across time. Beethoven's deafness and isolation produced the late string quartets. Van Gogh's mental illness produced the paintings. The difficulty is not the point. The work is the point. But the difficulty is also real, and pretending it did not exist in service of a more comfortable story about transcendence and triumph is a form of dishonesty that the person who bore the difficulty deserves better than. Michael Jackson deserves the complexity. He deserves the honest account that holds together the extraordinary talent and the genuine suffering and the contested accusations and the music that still does what it does regardless of any of those things. He deserves to be seen as a person rather than as a symbol, as someone with a specific history and specific wounds and specific gifts, who made specific choices under specific pressures and who produced in the process something that a new generation is only now beginning to discover. The discovery is happening right now, on the phones of young people who were not alive when he was alive, who are hearing Don't Stop Till You Get Enough for the first time and feeling what their parents felt when it was new. But the music can still do this, 40 years after it was made, in a world that has changed in almost every way. This is the enigma. This is what we cannot fully explain. This is what remains.